Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 6 game from the New York International. Now, if you followed the round 5 video, you know that I drew a tough game against Lee Run Zhou, a kid born in 2008 that plays pretty well. It was definitely a tricky game. I got some type of advantage in the King's Indian, but I didn't play the thematic G4 when I needed to. Any case, I still hadn't really played a clean game, and I was hoping to, actually play a good game, at least one good game in the tournament where I didn't make any glaring mistakes, I wasn't worse, and so on. And so this next game was another opportunity to do that. My opponent in this one was a lower-rated player, or lower than me, rather. His name was Huang, and he's actually a frequent visitor to the Marshall Chess Club. I've seen him around there. His FIA rating is around 2100, but he has a fairly, strong understanding of chess, so I wasn't taking him lightly by any means. And if you've seen some of the games already from this tournament, you know that I have been less than my best self. So anyways, I was black in this one, and let's get into it. So Gary played G3. A little bit of a surprise for me, but typically, if you want to play the fianchetto move order with G3, typically you actually should start with Knight F3, in my opinion, because at least here you could still go for your fianchetto, but you're not allowing E5. So I was a little bit perplexed by the G3 move order, just because you can get the same type of structure, but, start with Knight F3. So I wonder what he's actually concerned about with Knight F3 that he's not with G3. Maybe there are some lines where he's actually kind of inviting the English, like the G3, E5, C4, and maybe he just wants to transpose this way. And perhaps there's some lines of like if I respond with C5, we get a symmetrical English where he might actually prefer the knight on E2. So that's pretty much my best guess, but a little bit of a weird move order with G3. But now I went D5, and now Knight F3 is played, and I went C6, and pretty much I decided, after seeing the fianchetto, I was going to go for this London system, reverse London system type setup, because it's something that I've employed with pretty decent success in the past. Now, the other way I could, play the setup is in Queen's Gambit decline fashion with E6, Knight F6, Bishop E7. But I think these lines were, with C6, give me a little bit more of a dynamic game, so that's kind of why I wanted to go for it. After C6, White played Bishop G2. I went Knight F6, and now Castles was played. In my opinion, my humble opinion, I actually think C4 is a little bit more precise if you want to play this particular variation, because now you pretty much challenge my London system setup, because if I insist on going Bishop F5 now, you can actually take and go for Queen B3, and at least try to take advantage of this B7 pawn being loose. There are two reasonable ways Black can play. He can gambit the pawn with Knight C6, Queen takes B7, and Bishop D7 back, and argue that, Rook B8 and Knight B4 is a threat, so you have to go Queen B3. But after Rook B8 anyway, and then Queen D1, and now E5, White actually has a massive center for the pawn that he's lost, and a pretty decent initiative. So I think this is one way to play. The other way that's a little bit more solid is actually Queen B6. And in these lines, White actually normally winds up taking on B6 and essentially arguing that he's ever so slightly better just based upon the double pawns here and the sensitivity of the B5 square. So, but it's another way to play. I just think this one challenges the London system, the reverse London system, a little bit more than Castles, because after Castles, now after Bishop F5, if you go for C4, he went D3, but if you go for C4, now I can go E6, and the issue is now if C takes D5, I go E takes D5, and I keep my pawn chain intact, and Queen B3 is not really problematic here because of Queen B6. And this particular version of the double pawns are actually quite good for Black, because these 3 pawns here really do a fantastic job of blotting out the bishop on G2. So essentially, the difference is in the previous lines, if you play C takes D5, that diagonal's potentially open later, whereas if Black actually gets to play E takes D5, this diagonal will not be open. So that's kind of the key difference. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't note that the b5 square is actually covered in these lines, as opposed to with c takes d5, they weren't. So those are the two big differences. Anyways, after d3 was played, and I went e6, and now knight bd2 was played, and this is kind of the other way to play the system. Like, if you're not going to go for c4, you tend to build up for e4. So this kind of told me he's probably going to go for e4, given the fact that he, put the knight on d2 and didn't, play c4. So I just had to gear up for that. And I went for the move h6. And if you've seen me play the London system with white, you can see these are familiar moves. Essentially, h6 gives my bishop an escape square on h7. And I pretty much do it as soon as this knight lands on d2, because essentially before that, my bishop was not such a big deal about getting hunted down, because after knight h4, bishop g4, h3, bishop h5, if g4 now, I actually have knight f d7, and my bishop is actually preserved because I have queen takes h4. Whereas if the knight's actually on d2, knight f3 can reinforce the protection of that square. So knight df3 rather. So just to give you an example what that looks like, if I go, let's say I go in knight bd2, let's say I go bishop e7. Or actually, let's say I go knight bd7. Now knight h4 hunts the bishop down, because after bishop g4, h3, bishop h5, g4, and first of all, knight d7 isn't really a move now because my other knight's there. But let's say I go knight g8 back. Now the issue is that this knight can come over and support the one on h5, so g takes h5 is still a threat and the knight is protected. And if I insist on taking on h4, or at least trying to, at the move bishop e7, now actually white has the kind of annoying move knight f5. And the issue here is that after I'm going to lose one of my bishops now because they're both loose. And if I take on f5, the structure is actually quite unclear. Even though white has, these weird double pawns, white does have the two bishops and can very quickly undermine the center with c4. And this diagonal is not as secure as it once was now that I've played e takes f5 and my light square bishop is gone. So this position is actually quite unclear. But those are basically the dynamics at play, and that's why as soon as the knight comes to d2, it's pretty much time to consider h6. So anyways, after h6, white went queen e1, and this made some sense to me because he was trying to prepare e4, so this is pretty logical. Note that if you wanted to go rook e1, which seems like the natural way to prepare e4, the issue is actually after bishop e7, e4 still isn't possible, I don't think, because after d takes e4, and knight takes e4, there's actually a pin on d1, which prevents black from, or prevents white rather from holding everything together, and black would actually be a pawn up here for nothing because of that pin on the queen on d1. So because of that, you go queen e1 to step out of the way of this pin and also to avoid queen trades. So anyways, after queen e1, I went bishop e7, and now b3 was played. This was actually pretty logical. Now putting this bishop on b2, getting it on that long diagonal. And I must say, this is very similar. This entire structure is very similar to a game I played with black at the Grandmaster Chess Open. I can't recall the name of my opponent, but it was the round 8 game from that tournament. So definitely check that out, because I played the structure with black and it was extremely similar. And a lot of the themes are at play here as well. So the idea with b3 is you put the bishop on the long diagonal. You're going to tee up e4 eventually, and it's just a difference in move order. He's going to play e4 anyway. So anyways, now I played a5, and this is a move that I actually played in that game in the Grandmaster Chess Open in round 8 of that event, an earlier Road to Grandmaster video. And the reason that I played a5 here and in that game is because I really want to undermine the queenside pawn chain here and, potentially get a lever for my rook to actually activate. And with a5, I actually ask white an important question: how are you going to deal with this move? And there are 3 ways rather to deal with this move. One is to play a4 and stop it entirely. That was actually the move that was played in my game in this previous game I'm talking about. But when you play a4, you actually weaken some of these adjacent dark squares, and it's kind of strategically risky. The other way you can do is you could play a3, and that way you kind of hold up a4, because if I insist on going a4, then you go b4, and my pawn on a4 might be a weakness. And last but not least, I'll actually allow a4, but that's the one that you don't want to do, really, because that pawn tension is very annoying. But theoretically, you could go bishop b2 and ignore it. Here, my opponent decided to play a3, and I think this is actually the most sensible move, because you essentially don't weaken any of the squares in front of the queen side, so it makes sense to me. And now I just decided to castle. So I actually could have castled right away instead of playing a5, but I just wanted to, essentially have Gary answer that question. And after castles, e4 is played. I went bishop h7, dropping my bishop back to this square, and now bishop b2. And this position actually is very, very critical, because now I have to decide what my course of action is. You can see that there's this pawn tension on e4. I don't want to release that tension. That would be ill-advised, because white would go d takes e4. So if I go d takes, now white could go rook d1 and take advantage of the d file. And this knight could come to c4 as well, making use of the fact there's a d pawn here, and potentially I d6 as well. So I definitely don't want to take and release the tension. But there are different ways I can try and improve my position. And I was thinking, well, I could entertain c5, a little bit of a double-edged move that, isn't typically the most popular in these structures, because you're opening up this diagonal for the bishop. But I could go c5 and knight c6 and develop my knight actively there. But I think long-term, structurally, I didn't want to weaken this diagonal. The thing that I was really considering was putting a knight on d7, and that's actually what I should have done. But I didn't, and the reason I didn't put a knight on d7 is because I was kind of wary of this e5 push. So note that if I play knight bd7 to stop this knight e5 idea, now after e5, knight e8, my knight isn't trapped or anything, but it takes a long time to get to a reasonable square again. And maybe it's a6, maybe it's c5, but the knight on e8 won't be a good piece for a decent while. And I wasn't sure the consequences of this closed structure, given the fact that all of the minor pieces are actually on the board. So I was kind of uncertain of this particular setup. In the game I played in the Grand Chess Open, I actually did have this setup with e5 and knight e8, or e5 and knight d7, but the difference was that the dark square bishops were actually traded. So here, with all the pieces on the board, I was not so sure that this closed structure would pay dividends, because white could slowly build up an initiative on the king side with f4, g4, f5, and so on. So I didn't go knight bd7 because of e5. The other way, and this is actually something I should have played, is actually knight fd7. And the idea is here I can control the e5 square, and basically I don't run into e5 with tempo, and I just preserve this square for my knight on a6. And this actually would have been really sensible. Essentially, it was really important for me to cover that e5 square, because in these positions, it's actually the case that you do not want a knight to stay on e5 for too long. And if it does land on e5, you want to recapture it so that the bishop is on e5 and not another knight. Because when the bishop takes on e5, it's a little bit misplaced. But if it doesn't have to take on e5, well, then it's totally fine. So I went knight a6 kind of, because I was reluctant to, essentially allow this e5 move. But this is a step in the wrong direction, because it essentially allows this knight to occupy the square. And I really can't tolerate it there for too long. So I thought that, essentially white would not be able to build on the knight on e5 because of the e-pawn. So I was like, oh, this knight on e5 can't stay there forever. And because the knight can't go to f3, because I thought the e4 pawn would be hanging multiple times. But that wasn't so clear, and because after knight c5, now white plays f4, and the point is that he doesn't actually have to rush with putting this knight on f3, and can slowly build up his position with queen e2, rook a d1, or maybe even rook a e1. And it's very unclear where my counterplay is coming from if I don't resolve this tension. But I don't want to resolve the tension in many positions because of rook d1 and then the d file being an issue. So again, very, very important to challenge this knight on e5. After f4, I actually played knight of d7 and kind of recognized my mistake. But you could see I could have gotten a position similar to this without wasting multiple tempo, because basically I went around the horn, knight b8, knight a6, knight c5, just to trade this knight. So I wasted a few tempo in this position. And yeah, not great. Not great at all. White now went king h1, very good move, keeping the tension here. And this is actually the other point of the setup with not playing the knight to d7 right away, because now he's actually able to build up on the square. I took on e5, and after bishop takes e5, I went rook e8. And this was actually partially prophylaxis to deal with potential breaks with f5 or even sometimes g4 and queen g3. It's always nice to have a bishop on f8 where it protects g7, and the rook on the e-file could potentially be an asset if the e-file opens up for some reason. So I thought rook e8 was pretty reasonable. Another option was actually to just play knight d7 and then try to get this position that was very similar to my game at the Grand Chess Open, where I can go bishop f6. And, you know, with these traded bishops, this type of position where there are two pairs of minor pieces have come off the board, the space disadvantage on the king side is not as worrying in other structures, as it was in other structures, because he doesn't have as much artillery to attack me. The other thing is that, you know, the breakthrough on the king side is kind of risky, because whenever he pushes these pawns, the e5 pawn becomes very sensitive. And note that the diagonal here is already open for my light squared bishop. So black actually would have pretty decent counterplay by just launching a pawn assault, all-out assault on the queen side. So this type of position would be kind of playable for black. So that's one option. Another option would have been to actually play a4. And the point is it's a very weird looking move to play a4, because, again, you invite this b4 idea. But the point is I get knight d7 with tempo, and if the bishop goes back, I actually go b5. And the point is, strangely enough, that I'm fixing the b4 and a3 pawns to eventually play c5 myself and undermine the structure. Now, this is a setup that I probably wouldn't play, and I don't think many humans would go for it, because it seems kind of weird to just open up this diagonal for this bishop on g2. But the point is, actually, black can go rook c8 and then c5, and it won't be on this diagonal forever. So, very playable setup. But instead, I went rook e8. After rook e8, Gary went queen f2. This is a reasonable move, connecting the rooks finally, and also, you know, maybe teeing up something on f7, and also keeping an eye on my c5 knight. I went knight d7. The knight no longer had a purpose on c5, and e4 was more than protected, so there was no entertaining pressure on the e4 square anymore. And after bishop d4, white says, I want to keep my dark square bishop. I'm not going to trade it. And now here's another kind of critical position for me, because, again, the question is, how am I playing here? Where's my counterplay? It would appear that white can build up with rook ae1. Well, maybe not right away because the a3 pawn is hanging. But it appears that, you know, white is the one that's playing in the middle right now, can maybe play rook fe1 and then knight f3 and then build up that way. Sometimes actually rook g1 and g4, g5 is an idea. I just wasn't too sure what I should be doing. I mean, I didn't want to play c5 because I didn't want to open this diagonal. I thought that bishop f6 now was kind of ill-advised because he was going to go e5 with tempo and then follow up with g4. And I just kind of got frustrated because I didn't see any direct plan. And so I went for the move bishop f8. It actually turns out here that a4 again is actually a quite decent move. And the point is that after b4 now, instead of playing b5 like in the previous lines, I can actually go rook c8. And the idea is to push forward with c5 because I have enough pieces on that square to support the break. And that would have given me very, very needed counterplay on the queen side before white really gets going on my king side. So this would have been a pretty legitimate way to play. Instead, after bishop f8, white now went g4, and I got really, really panicked because if you just look at the position, it just looks like white is, looking to run over black, and I couldn't really see. I wasn't really sure how I parry this. I mean, now the thing is, I wasn't actually sure what white's next move is. Like, it just looks really dangerous. G5 looks kind of weird to me because I could take on G5 and then go bishop G6. F5 also looks a little bit strange because you weaken all these dark squares, and I could probably just push E5. But again, it was just kind of disconcerting to have these pawns like this and no direct play. And because of that, I kind of lashed out irrationally and played d takes e4. And the reason I say irrationally is because I'm releasing the tension in a position where I'm not actually getting anything in exchange for doing so. So really, if that's the case, I shouldn't do it because I'm also, bringing a potential white piece into the game. Instead, a4 again should have been played. And the point is that after b4, I have this rook c8 idea, and I can follow up with the c5 break and get much needed counterplay. Now, g5 is a move here and can be played, but again, I can actually just take and go bishop g6, protecting f7, and I'm actually quite solid here. It's not so easy for white to continue to build up. I mean, maybe knight f3 does the trick with the idea of knight h4, but I believe that black should have some resources here. Yeah, it's not the end of the world. Although knight h4 is a scary looking move to face because then the g6 pawn comes under fire. Note that if d takes e4, now knight h4, and this is a problem connected with queen f7. But maybe I have something like queen g5 here. Takes, bishop queen h5. Yeah, maybe this position is playable. But okay, it is certainly dangerous for sure. And the two bishops are really, really good. But this is something I could have considered. Instead, it's much better than the move I did, this d takes e4 stuff. Because essentially, after d takes e4 and knight takes e4, white is kind of converging on the middle of the board. And this knight that was on d2 that was kind of dominated by my d5 pawn, now all of a sudden is centralized and active. Now, knight takes e4 actually was not the most trying move. Instead, bishop takes e4 was a little bit better because you actually remove a defender around my king. This would actually been kind of tough for me to deal with. The computer was saying knight f6 to challenge this bishop, and then after bishop takes h7 check, knight takes h7. But this position with rook g1 already looks extremely scary. G5 might be an idea. F5 might be an idea. Of course, this knight converging to the F4 E4 square is still a possibility. Very, very tough position to handle. So definitely another viable option for white. Knight takes e4 is flawed, and there's actually one move here that proves the flaw with knight takes e4, but I didn't see it. It's actually quite unusual. It's actually quite an unusual move, actually, but it's kind of a funny coincidence that this move was also this whole theme, and this move is thematic in the King's Indian, and was actually in the line that I played with white in my previous game against Liren Zhou. So the move actually here is f5. And the point is, by playing f5, I actually stop the f4 pawn in its tracks, and I actually create split pawns in white's camp, because after g takes f5, e takes f5, these pawns are split, and now the queen and the rook on the f file are actually entirely misplaced because they don't have any counterplay there anymore, and he has to quickly shift with rook g1 and bishop f3, and that takes time. In the meantime, I can go knight f6, potentially knight g4, maybe even bishop e7, bishop e6. The point is I actually slow down white's initiative and get play of my own. And so this would actually been a very, very interesting choice, and very, very thematic, actually, because now it's actually black that has the healthier pawn structure, believe it or not, because of these split pawns. That being said, it's still complicated, and, anything can happen. It's definitely a 3 results game. But f5 would have been a huge move. Instead, I thought, I need to sort of neutralize white's pressure in the middle, and I played bishop takes e4. But this move is extremely risky and objectively bad, because after bishop takes e4, I've given white the 2 bishops, and they're pointing very menacingly at my king, and it's very difficult to, stop this onslaught with g5 for f5 that's coming. I played the move knight f6. This was essentially my idea with the exchange, was that I thought I was now going to get the opportunity to also trade another pair of pieces. I thought that I'd be able to hold this position if I managed to trade some pieces and neutralize his initiative. And here, the move Gary should have played is actually g5. After knight takes e4, d takes e4, I'd have to play queen e7 to just get out of these rook a d1 ideas. And if g takes h6, I actually need to play g6 to kind of try and play around the h6 pawn and maybe even use it as a blockader for myself. But white would be better here. The computer was giving rook a e1, bishop takes h6, and rook e3. And after bishop g7, it looks like I'm able to trade the bishops too and then swing my rook over and get a totally satisfactory position. But here, rook h3 is actually pretty annoying, because now if I take on d4, after queen takes d4, there's a mate threat on h8. So it's actually not entirely, I'm not entirely out of the woods yet, and the position remains better for white. So that would have been a way to kind of press the initiative a little bit more. Unfortunately for Gary, he actually played bishop f3, and it's understandable from the that he wanted to keep his bishop pair, right? We talk about the bishop pair all the time, about how it's an asset, but this actually gives me much needed time to consolidate my position. And the really big problem with bishop f3 is that it's not doing anything on this diagonal. It's also not doing anything eyeing these pawns. It was really only doing anything eyeing the king. And so the bishop on f3 is actually not so hot right now. And I thought, I should have a decent counterplay now with the move knight d5, because now I hit f4 with tempo, which is kind of annoying to defend. Note that if you play a move like queen g3, now I can go bishop d6 and level more pressure against the f4 pawn. And just in general, now I have counterplay on the dark squares. So, yeah. So anyways, after knight d5, white actually played g5. And this move is actually a huge mistake, and particularly in conjunction with bishop f3, because now he's actually completely forfeited control over the f5 square. And in this moment, this gives me the much needed opportunity to play the move g6. And you can see here now that f5 is pretty much an impossibility, because I have both my g pawn and my e pawn on that square. And now I have a potential outpost for my knight later. And yeah, I'm actually starting to neutralize white's pressure. Note that after a move like g takes h6, I can just recapture, and again, if f5 isn't coming, there's actually no attack. And in the long term, I now would just love to trade the dark squared bishops, because these pawns now become targets if they don't get forced up the board. So after g6, this game really turned, in my opinion, because now it was quite clear there's no attack. Gary tried to keep it going with h4 now, trying to build this initiative further, entertain h5. But now I played h5 and locked up the king side. And you could just see here now that f5 is not really in the cards. And now I've managed to kind of neutralize white's initiative. I can slow play the position again and kind of wait on a weakness. And again, long term now, trading these bishops would be really desirable, because all his pawns are nested on dark squares and will be targets. After h5, white went c4, and I went knight e7, and I didn't mind saying the c4 move, because now d3 is a target, and my knight just gets pushed to another really nice outpost. And now bishop e4 is played, I think, covering this f5 square, so that if I play knight f5, he can just take it. And I wasn't really sure about these types of positions where my pawns were doubled. I figured that if I have to play e takes f5, I need to do it under really, really good circumstances where I control the e file or something like that, because there's always bishop e5 as an opportunity to kind of shut down the e file. So I didn't want to rush with this knight f5 move and was kind of patient with it. I decided to play queen d7 here, which had a dual purpose of kind of holding out on playing knight f5, entertaining doubling on the d file in some lines, and also sometimes even playing e5 if white kind of lost some coordination, because my queen could come into h3 with check. So that was kind of the idea with queen d7. But I actually miss a valuable opportunity here to clarify my position strategically. And it's kind of funny because I was talking about this and thinking about this, and the move is actually, instead of queen d7, bishop g7. And the point is that I'm actually able to trade these bishops now because the rook is actually on a1, so he's actually forced to trade these bishops. And the issue is that after bishop takes g7, king takes g7, this is actually what I was afraid of, but it turns out that it's not a big deal. If queen b2 check, I can actually just go king g8. And the issue is that knight f5 is actually a very legitimate threat here because white actually lacks control of the e file. So if you try to go rook fe1 to kind of deal with this knight f5 idea, I actually can go knight f5 anyway. And if you don't take this knight, I'm going to take on h4 or go knight d4 or something like that and ravage the dark squares. But if you take it, after e takes f5, the issue is actually that this king is fairly naked because all of his pawns are advanced, and his lack of control of the e file is actually a huge problem. So for instance, if your rook takes e8, queen takes e8, and queen d2, trying to take back that e file, now I actually have this nice move queen e7, and I'm actually hitting the a3 pawn and threatening to go rook e8. And because you can't, prevent both, the more important is the e file. But now I play queen takes a3, and the position is just collapsing because, again, my king is much safer. I'm already threatening b3. I can consolidate with rook d8, and white will just not hold this position because his king is too weak. So I actually missed a real idea to go bishop g7, and I didn't get that chance for quite a while again, because after the move queen d7, which I played, now rook a d1, the issue is that after bishop g7, which I actually played now black doesn't actually force the exchange. White can play bishop e5, and this is actually something that I overlooked. The point that now taking on e5 is not as desirable, I thought, because queen takes f7 is always an idea, and I don't want to give up my knight for the bishop on f5 so quickly if I don't get, again, control of the e file. So after bishop e5, I actually went rook bd8 and had to switch gears and kind of, play a little bit of a waiting game because I didn't manage to get the exchange I wanted, and quite frankly, I'm not better. I can't push my pawns to improve my position on the king side because that would create too many weaknesses. And if I push my pawns on the queen side, it actually gives his bishop some targets. So I actually kind of have to sit tight and wait on white to, do something. So rook a d8 at least eyes the d file and gets some pressure on d3. White now went queen c5. That's a reasonable move, just, activating the queen. I now went rook a8 back. The computer actually suggests bishop takes f5. Bishop takes e5, and after e takes e5, f takes e5, knight f5. And the point is that after bishop f5, ef5, now I actually am threatening queen d4. And the thing that I overlooked here is that if d4 is played, it appears that white is kind of rolling with the pawns and has consolidated everything. But the other idea with this queen on d7 is that diagonal and that square in h3. And now f4 is actually decisive because the queen infiltrates. So there were some lines where I can get away with playing knight f5 and very quickly follow it up with a f4 move, this little breakthrough. But I just missed that line here. So, yeah. So anyways, after queen c5, I just went rook a8 back, and you can see I'm just kind of waiting. I'm just waiting on white to do something. White went rook fe1. I went rook e d8 now, given that the a5 pawn would be hanging if I move the a rook. I move the other one to d8. And now bishop f6 was played, and I went bishop f8. I wasn't really sure about taking on f6 because I was a little bit worried that after g takes f6, there might be some queen g5, queen h6 ideas, or even rook g1 and bishop takes g6 ideas as well. So I didn't really want to do that. So I went bishop f8, just preserving the structure. And at least now my bishop on this diagonal, the queen's under fire, and maybe even the a3 pawn. White now went queen e5, getting the queen off that diagonal, and I went rook e8, getting my rook off of the line of the bishop on f6. And now queen b2 was played, now protecting the a3 pawn, and I went knight c8. And again, I'm just kind of dancing around, waiting for something to happen. Whether it's on d6 or e7, I don't think it makes a huge difference where my knight is, as long as it's close to f5. Now bishop e5 was played. I went knight d6. And here, finally, after dancing around for like 10 or 11 moves, white actually made a mistake. He should kind of hang tight and not really do anything crazy. But if he wants to be active, he can actually play the move c5 now. And the point is, by playing c5, you actually lock up my pawn on b7 and make it backward. And if I play knight f5 now, after this trade and d4, I really can't get into the position at all because this bishop is so powerful. It's doing a great job of just controlling everything. And I am a pawn down on the queen side, so I can't do anything too crazy or I might lose the endgame. So, okay, I'm not losing here because my king is much safer than white's and I have good control of the light squares. But my point is that I can't like trade queens or do anything super rash because then white can actually entertain winning. So, yeah, this position after c5 would pretty much fizzle out because I can't really go knight f5 and, okay, maybe I can go knight c8 and just wait. But now I can actually go b4 and try to play along the a file. So, yeah. Instead, though, Gary made a very, very critical mistake here with the move d4. And this was actually the move I was kind of sitting on, waiting on for quite a bit, because I recognize that when you play d4, you actually create some new weaknesses. The e4 bishop is less secure, and now actually the pawn on c4 is less secure. And it's kind of funny because I'm actually able to take advantage of that right away with the move a4. And the problem here, simply put, is that b4 is impossible because I have knight takes c4. And so this is actually a huge issue because now I'm going to create some weakness on the queen side and activate my a rook. Note that if you play bishop takes d6, that's the other problem. After queen takes, I have a double attack on a3 and f4, and even a takes b3, and you simply can't defend both. And in this obstacle bishop position, my bishop on f8 will be significantly better than the bishop on e4 because white's kingside pawns are targets, whereas mine are actually restricting the bishop on e4. So yeah, after a4, the position just kind of gets unlocked and goes downhill. White played bishop d3, protecting the c4 pawn, but now I get a takes b3, and this is a huge deal because now the c4 pawn is weak and the a3 pawn is weak, and it just happens under the best possible circumstances for me. After queen takes b3, I now went knight f5, and the reason I did it now is because I'm actually threatening rook takes the a3 and knight takes h4, and you can't really defend both. a4 was played, but if you play bishop takes f5, I'm actually going to start with rook takes a3 because there's no effective intermediate move here for white. Note that if you play bishop e6, I actually just go queen e6, and now my queen can actually come to h3 with check once the queen on b3 is forced to move. And that would actually be a very quick mating net. So it just, a huge, huge problem is that this intermediate move, rook takes e3, a3 can't be allowed. So instead, a4 is played, but now I go knight takes h4, and I've won a very, very important pawn. And you can see now that a4 is going to be sensitive, f4 is going to be sensitive, and I actually can trade the dark squared bishops under more reasonable circumstances now because the queen is not even able to, eye this diagonal anymore. So after bishop e4, I went bishop d6 now, trying to begin operations, trading that bishop on e5. And after rook d3, I went queen c7, which I thought was a good move. I want to take on e5, but note that if I take right away after d takes e5, queen c7, it's white that actually gets the d file and can play like rook e d1 or something like this, and rook d7. And if I go rook d8, now rook d6 is actually kind of annoying. So I didn't want to allow something like this to happen, where he gets some counterplay. So because of that, I just thought queen c7, I wait on capturing. I will take on e5 at the right moment, but I just want to be able to contest on the d file. After queen c7, white now went c5, forcing my hand a little bit. But I'm cool with this, because after bishop takes d5 and d takes e5, I now went queen a5. And the point is that now c5 is hit and a4 is hit, and you just can't defend both. And I'm going to secure a second pawn. White went rook e2, covering his rook. That was actually the other idea with queen a5, is this attack on the e1 rook, so he had to step out of that. And now I go queen takes c5, and I'm just 2 pawns up, and it's very, very difficult for white to try and recover the material because my queen and rook can start to infiltrate as well. White played rook c2, challenging my queen, and I went queen a5 back, now eyeing that e1 square. And now rook d4 was played, covering the a4 pawn, which I thought was actually kind of interesting because he's actually inviting queen e1 check. But I actually couldn't find any direct win after queen e1 and king h2. I couldn't find any immediate win, which was kind of annoying me. I went queen e1 anyway, but after king h2, I stopped and looked at this position, and it's like the king is actually kind of secured for now with the rook and the queen eyeing the second and third rank. And the bishop is actually dominating my knight right now, so I pretty much need to bring other pieces into the game to get this done. And that's why I played rook a d8, trying to trade these rooks and just in general undermine some of the protection on this side of the board. Queen d3 is played, reasonable move. You can't allow rook d8, because then my rook comes in with decisive effect. So you have to try and fight for the file. And after queen d3, I took on d4 and went rook a8. Because now my point is that if my rook is somehow able to get into the game, it's decisive. So I have an idea of potentially keeping an eye on this a4 pawn, and so it actually freezes the queen on d4. Rook b2 is played, challenging my b7 pawn, potentially going for some counterplay here. And I had to be a little bit careful because I don't want to, very, very quickly run the rook off of the 8th rank, because there might be some perpetuals with queen d8 and queen f6. And I also wanted to be a little bit careful about rushing with knight f5, because I was wary of some lines where bishop takes f5, e takes f5, e6 could be played. So it's very important that my queen is on e1 to kind of deal with this stuff. So I played c5, and the reason I played c5 is because I really want my rook to get the d file. So I thought even if it's at the cost of a pawn, if queen takes c5 and I get in rook d8, I should, have a really promising position. But the issue here is that after queen takes c5, that bishop on e4 is actually hanging. So he actually has to hold on to the queen. The queen has to hold on to the e4 bishop. And so queen d3 is the only move to essentially protect this bishop and also stave off my rook d8 idea. Note that if you go queen c4, I'm going to go rook d8 and, not rook e8, rook d8, and enter with decisive effect with rook d1 or maybe even rook d2 check. And that would just be all she wrote. So very, very important that you go queen d3. And now I went knight f5. And my idea for going knight f5 now was I thought that now that the queen is actually off of the 4th rank in general, I actually always have queen h4 check and queen takes f4 as an important resource. And so I thought that this queen actually is not very ideally placed to deal with this threat. And also the pawn on the 4th rank is also, the pawn on a4 is also loose. So this whole 4th rank is extremely sensitive. So I thought knight f5 is now pretty well timed. And now that my pawn is actually on c5, I thought that I can entertain knight d4 as a possibility. Of course, rook takes a4 is a possibility. Just a lot of things can happen now my knight's on f5. White actually took with bishop takes f5. But now, after e takes f5, this is actually just losing because my queen on e1 is controlling the e6 break. So his king is actually just too naked and vulnerable to checks for him to entertain any serious initiative on my king. Gary played e6 anyway, trying to get some counterplay here, but I just went queen takes e6, and I'm now 3 pawns up, so this is just a reasonable task now. And after rook takes b7, he gets one of his pawns back, but I just went rook e8. And you can see here, if my queen and rook enter, it's over. And even the rook endgames are winning for me. So he really can't even trade any pieces. He went queen c2, at least covering queen e2 check. And I decided to play queen e3 because I thought there's no reason to trade queens if I can deliver mate. And I saw that I can just take on f4 with a decisive effect. Gary now played queen c4, which was his last-ditch effort with like a few seconds left on the clock to do something. And you can see he's actually threatening mate on f7. But the issue is that I can mate him first. And so I just double-checked just to make sure I wasn't blundering anything and played queen f2 check. And here Gary actually resigned. The reason is it's pretty much mate in a few, however you slice it. If you go king h3, it's actually rook e3 mate on the spot. And if you go king h1, it's rook e1 and then mate on f1. So after queen f2, there's nothing to be done. So anyways, this was a little bit better than my previous game, at least. I did show some reasonable ideas in the middle game, and I did have a decent opening. But I did allow this knight e5 move early on, and allowing the knight to sort of remain in that outpost allowed white to generate a kingside attack that was probably more dangerous than it actually turned out to be, or it should have been more dangerous than it turned out to be, because yeah, he just didn't, play with enough force at a moment where retreating was not the option. And when he did retreat with bishop f3, it gave me an opportunity to consolidate, and the position kind of just unraveled from there when I was able to sort of get my position where I can kind of grind it out. And we know I'm good at that, at least. So happy to get a win, too. It had been a little bit, so always nice to win a game when it's, you haven't won in a little while. So I'll take it. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.